A Tuesday. A dirt path between two properties. A woman balancing a warm dish in her hands, walking toward a house that had gone quiet in ways a house shouldn't go quiet. She wasn't making a declaration. She wasn't performing an act of romance. She was simply doing what she had always done, showing up, quietly, without being asked, without expecting a receipt. And on a particular Tuesday in September of 1883, she set that pie on a porch railing, said something that a man didn't fully understand until weeks later, and walked back across the field toward her own land. It would take him 14 days to figure out what she meant. It would take him 3 years to deserve to ask. This is the story of Clara Weston and Edmund Hale. It is a story about a woman who knew her own mind long before the world around her was willing to acknowledge that women had minds worth knowing. It is a story about a man who almost let arithmetic convince him to walk away from the best thing life had quietly placed in front of him. And it is a story about what happens when two people, separated by 30 years of age and one weather-beaten fence line, decide that what matters isn't what the town thinks. What matters is what's true. Let's begin. Clara Weston had been running the south-facing 40 acres since her father's knees gave out, and her mother followed her older sister to Pueblo. She was 26 years old in the autumn of 1883, and she had the particular self-possession of a woman who had been making real decisions since she was 19. She knew how to read weather in the color of a morning sky. She knew which cattle brokers at the Alamosa market would try to undercut her, and which ones respected a woman who showed up prepared. She knew the exact pitch of the creek when it was thinking about flooding and the exact moment to move her stock to higher ground before it did. She also knew her neighbor, had known him most of her life. Edmund Hale was 56 years old. He had come to the San Luis Valley before the railroad. He had built his ranch with the specific stubbornness of a man who didn't need anyone to believe in his plan because he already believed in it enough for a small army. He had raised cattle, mended his own fences, and spent 22 years married to a woman named Josephine, who had died in the winter of 1880 after an illness that took longer than it should have and was more cruel than it needed to be. After Josephine died, Edmund did what men of his generation did. He went back to work the next morning. He didn't speak of it much. He grew quieter than he had been, which was already quite quiet. The ranch continued. The cattle were fed. The seasons turned. And Edmund Hale moved through them like a man navigating a house in the dark, carefully, methodically, careful not to knock anything over, careful not to make a sound that would echo too loudly in all that empty space. Clara had noticed all of this. She had been noticing Edmund Hale her whole life, which is different from the kind of noticing that announces itself. It was the kind of noticing that doesn't need to say anything because it already knows everything. She knew that he checked the north fence line in the late afternoon. She knew that he took his coffee on the porch most mornings, regardless of the weather, as though sitting inside was a kind of defeat he wasn't willing to accept. She knew that when he smiled, genuinely smiled, not the polite version, it arrived slowly, reshaping his face like something thawing after a long winter. She had started bringing food about a month after Josephine's funeral. Not every week, not with any announcement, just on Tuesdays, when the rhythm of her own work allowed it. A pot of stew, a loaf of bread, whatever was abundant and warm. Every time Edmund said the same thing, "You didn't need to do this." Every time Clara said the same thing, "I know." That was the whole exchange. And for 3 years it was enough. It was its own kind of language. In the autumn of 1883, Clara's apple tree on the south end of the property came in the way it only came in every few years. Generous and golden and improbably sweet. She picked the best of them on a Monday evening and made a pie the way her mother had taught her. Cold butter worked quickly. Cold hands. A crust that doesn't know it's been rushed. She crimped the edges with more precision than the occasion strictly required, and if she understood why she was being so careful, she didn't examine it directly. She carried it across the field on Tuesday morning under a sky that was doing what September skies do in southern Colorado, performing an impossible shade of blue, the kind that makes everything below it feel like it's been painted by someone who had very strong opinions about beauty. Edmund was on the porch. He usually was on Tuesday mornings. She had never mentioned this pattern, and neither had he, which was itself a kind of communication between two people who are very good at not saying things. She came up the steps and held out the pie. He looked at it with the genuine appreciation of a man who understood the value of a well-made thing. "September apples," she said. "The sweet ones," he said, and she understood that he had been paying attention too, in his own way. In the quiet way, he paid attention to everything. He looked at the pie and then he looked at her, and something moved across his face. The slow arrival of that rare, real smile, and he said, in the easy tone of a man delivering a gentle joke, "If only I were 20 years younger." He meant it to land lightly, to move past quickly. Clara looked at him. The morning held them both. A hawk was turning slow circles above the cottonwood where Josephine was buried. The mountains to the west were doing nothing in particular except being enormous and permanent and entirely unconcerned with the small drama unfolding on a ranch porch below them. 20 years wouldn't be enough, Clara said. Then she set the pie on the railing, told him she had cattle to check, and walked back across the field without looking behind her. Edmund stood on his porch and looked at the pie for a long time. Then he went inside and tried to figure out what that meant. Before we go further, I want to pause for just a moment. If you're listening to this story today, wherever you are in the world, I'd love to know. Drop your country or your city in the comments below. This story has reached people from places I never imagined when I first started telling them. And knowing where you are makes every word feel more connected. Now, let's go back. Because Edmund Hale is about to spend 2 very long weeks in conversation with his horse. Edmund was not a man who processed things quickly. He was thorough. He turned ideas the way you turn compost, patiently checking the layers, willing to wait until something useful emerged. He turned those 5 words of Clara's 20 years wouldn't be enough for 14 days before he thought he understood them. In those 14 days, he fixed the section of south pasture fence that had been leaning since spring. He reshod 2 horses that didn't strictly need it yet. He reorganized the grain store. He spoke at length to his gelding, a gray horse named August, who was elderly and had the philosophical patience of an animal that has seen a great many seasons come and go and has made his peace with all of them. August's contributions to these conversations were largely expressed through the ears, one forward, one sideways, which Edmund had learned to interpret as interested neutrality. On the 14th day, Edmund rode into Alamosa for supplies and heard something at the dry goods store that landed differently than it should have. The storekeeper mentioned in the easy way of a man relaying information he considered settled, that young Henry Forsyth, 29 years old, good family, his father owned the most profitable trading post between Alamosa and Durango, had been calling on Clara Weston for the better part of the summer. The town approved of it. He was young. He had prospects. He would, people agreed, make an excellent match for a capable woman who had been running that south property alone for too long. Edmund bought his flour and his nails. He rode home. He put August in the barn and gave him extra grain without knowing quite why. He sat on his porch in the spot where Clara had set the pie 3 weeks earlier, and he thought about a woman who had walked across a field every Tuesday for 3 years without ever asking for anything in return, without keeping any kind of account, without once making him feel like her presence was a transaction he was expected to settle. He thought about Josephine. Not with guilt. Josephine had been gone 3 years, and she had been, while she was here, a woman of such clear-eyed good sense that he knew with certainty she would have had opinions about him, sitting on this porch processing something that was already obvious to anyone paying attention. She had told him more than once that his caution was one of his finest qualities and also, when taken too far, his most stubborn flaw, that there was a version of being careful that was really just being afraid and calling it something respectable. He went inside and looked at himself in the small mirror by the washstand. 56 years on a face will leave their record. The gray had taken over completely. The lines were deep. The Colorado sun had done what Colorado sun does over decades of outdoor work. He had a specific conversation with his reflection, the kind of conversation a man has when he's trying to talk himself into something his better judgment has already decided, and he's just waiting for the rest of himself to catch up. His better judgment won before sunset. He put on his hat. He walked across the field. Clara was mending the boundary fence on the east side of her property when she heard him. Not coming through the gate, standing at the fence line, the shared border, technically neutral ground, which she noticed and understood without remarking on it. He put his hands on the top rail and looked at her, the way he looked at things he had decided about. She kept working. She had learned over 3 years that Edmund Hale said things in his own time, and that waiting was both more efficient and more dignified than prompting. "Clara," he said. "Edmund," she said without looking up, "I've been thinking about what you said." "Which thing?" she asked, though she knew. "You know which thing?" She set down the fencing tool. She looked at him. He was quiet for a moment. The late afternoon was turning the grass gold. The mountains to the west were holding the last of the light with that particular authority mountains have, as though time moves differently near them, as though they have agreed to slow it down for anyone willing to pay attention. 20 years wouldn't be enough, he said carefully. I've been sitting with that for 2 weeks, and I think I know what you meant, but I want to be honest with you. I'm not certain, and I'm not a man who acts on uncertainty. He looked at the fence rail, then he looked at her. I am 56 years old. I know what that means, and I know what it costs. I am not going to pretend it's nothing, and I am not going to ask you to pretend it's nothing. But I would like to know if you're willing to tell me what you meant when you said it. Clara looked at this man, this careful, weathered, thoroughly decent man who had accepted her Tuesdays for 3 years with the same 2 words. You didn't have to, and had never once pushed past them to ask why she kept coming anyway. It meant, she said, that 20 years younger would have made you someone else. And it's you I was talking about. Not a younger version of you. Not a different version, you. Exactly as you are. The fence line between them was very quiet. Somewhere behind Edmund, August made a sound from the barn that could generously be interpreted as approval. All right, Edmund said, which was the most Edmund Hale thing he had ever said. And then, may I come calling properly? Clara looked at him for a long moment. Edmund Hale, she said. I have been walking across that field every Tuesday for 3 years. You might have asked me that question any one of those 156 Tuesdays. But I'm glad you're asking now. She picked up the fencing tool. Come for supper Thursday, she said. I have good beef stock, and I know you've been cooking for yourself too long. He went back across the field with something in his chest that felt, cautiously and without announcement, like hope. The town of Alamosa, which was, in 1883, a town with opinions about everything, particularly about the lives of women who operated independently and men who had outlived their wives, had, of course, immediate and comprehensive thoughts about what was developing between the Weston property and the Hale Ranch. Martha Elkins at the millinery was direct, as she was about everything. He's 56, she said to Clara one afternoon in late October. She said it the way you state a fact that you believe should be self-explanatory. I'm aware, Clara said pleasantly. Henry Forsyth is 29 and his father just signed a new contract with the Territorial Supply Commission. He's been asking after you for months. Clara examined a spool of green thread. Henry Forsyth is a perfectly agreeable person, she said. I have no argument with Henry Forsyth. Then why? Do you know what Edmund Hale did last spring when the creek took out 40 yards of my east fence? Clara set down the thread and looked at Martha directly. He showed up the next morning with lumber he couldn't really spare. I didn't ask him. He didn't mention it afterward. He just came, and he worked, and he left. She paused. That's not a small thing. That's a man's whole character right there in one morning. Martha had the grace to be quiet about it after that. Her friend Ruth, who was 28, recently married, and therefore considered herself an expert on the subject, was less quiet. He's 30 years older than you, Clara. Closer to 28. That's not the point. I know it isn't. Clara looked out her kitchen window at the distant outline of the Hale Ranch against the darkening blue of the mountains. The point is that I have been paying attention to that man for a long time, and what I have seen is someone who says what he means, does what he says, and treats every living thing on his property, cattle, horses, the elderly dog he's had for 12 years, with patience and consistency. She turned back to Ruth. Patience and consistency. Do you know how rare that is? Because I've been watching for it my whole life, and I've only ever seen it in one place. Ruth had nothing to say to that, which was its own kind of victory. Henry Forsyth did come by once in November. He brought wine from his father's store, imported from somewhere back east, and he sat in Clara's kitchen with the easy confidence of a young man who had been told his whole life that confidence was a reasonable substitute for most other qualities. He was not unkind. He was not even arrogant exactly. He He was simply very certain that the situation was developing in his favor, and certainty of that kind, Clara had found, tends to make a person stop actually looking at what's in front of them. He talked about his father's contracts. He talked about the new house he was planning to build on the south side of town, larger than anything currently standing. He talked about what Alamosa would become once the railroad expanded further. And all of this was fine. All of it was reasonable. All of it described a perfectly adequate future. Clara poured him coffee and thanked him for the wine and told him kindly and without apology that she didn't think she was the right match for him, and that she hoped he'd find someone who would be. He left with dignity, which she respected. She heard later that he had begun calling on the youngest Hargrove daughter before December, which she respected even more. She stood at her kitchen window afterward and looked across the field. The November light was thin and silver. The mountains were dark against a sky the color of pewter. Somewhere out there, in the particular November quiet of a ranch that had begun incrementally to come back to life, Edmund was checking his north fence line. She knew his patterns the way you know the patterns of things you love without ever deciding to. The knowledge just accumulates, year by year, Tuesday by Tuesday, until one day you realize you know someone's life as well as your own. She put on her coat and walked across the field. Not with a pie this time. Not with anything except herself. There is a particular quality to courtship between two people who have known each other for years. It doesn't move the way young courtship moves, not with the electricity of discovery, not with the drama of uncertainty about the other person's fundamental nature. Those questions are already answered. What remains is something quieter and in its own way more intimate. Clara and Edmund had conversations on his porch that lasted until the November stars were out. They talked about the valley, what it had been when both of them arrived, what it was becoming, whether the arrival of the railroad was a thing to welcome or a thing to be careful about, and how those two things were not mutually exclusive. They disagreed on some of it, which Edmund found he liked considerably. He had spent 3 years living inside his own thoughts and a different perspective, offered without apology and with genuine evidence behind it, turned out to be one of the better things about being alive. They rode together on Sunday afternoons through the aspen groves south of the ranch, where in November the last gold leaves were letting go, drifting down into the dry grass below in the unhurried way of things that have done their job and are ready to rest. Clara rode well. She had been riding since before she could properly remember, and Edmund noticed, as he had noticed everything about her, the ease of it, the complete absence of performance. She was at all times exactly herself. No more, no less, and not a single degree of adjustment made for his benefit or anyone else's. He found this extraordinary. He had not previously known how rare it was because he had not previously been looking for it. But once you see it, you understand what you'd been missing, and you feel the absence of it in everything that came before. He proposed to her on a Thursday evening in January, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the directness of a man who had decided something and saw no reason to dress it up beyond what it was. "I would like to marry you," he said. "I am not a romantic man in the traditional sense. I cannot promise you poetry. I can promise you that I will work hard, keep my word, and never give you a reason to doubt where I stand. I can promise you that I will never take for granted what it means that you kept walking across that field." Clara looked at him across the kitchen table. "Yes," she said. Simply. Completely. They were married in March of 1884 on a morning when the last of the winter snow was pulling back from the lower meadows and the first tentative green was appearing in the south-facing slopes. The ceremony was in the Alamosa church, and the attendance was substantial, because the town had invested considerably in opinions about this match and wanted to see how it resolved in person. Clara wore a dress the color of Colorado sage, not white, because she was not a woman who performed conventions that didn't serve her. Edmund wore his good jacket and stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him down the aisle and felt, with the full weight of 56 years behind it, the particular gratitude of a man who almost talked himself out of something irreplaceable. The ranch became something new when it became theirs. Not his with her added in, but genuinely shared in the way that only works when both people are capable, and neither one needs to diminish the other to feel sufficient. Clara took over the accounts within the first week. Edmund watched her go through 3 years of his bookkeeping with the focused attention of someone who finds disorder intellectually offensive, And within a month, she had reorganized the whole system and identified two purchasing patterns that were costing them money they didn't need to spend. He watched this and felt not threatened, but grateful. Grateful to have someone who cared enough about their shared future to actually look at it clearly. She also, on 2 occasions, repaired sections of fence he had been meaning to get to. He came home to find the work already done, cleanly, correctly, without comment. He cooked on Wednesdays. He was better at it than he had ever admitted. They divided the labor not according to what was traditional, but according to what each of them was best at, which turned out to be a considerably more efficient system, and one that neither of them found remarkable because neither of them had any particular attachment to the way things had always been done. Their daughter arrived in February of 1886. They named her Margaret for Clara's mother. She came into the world with Edmund's gray eyes and Clara's red hair and a disposition evident from the very first weeks of absolute determination to understand everything she encountered. Edmund had worried quietly during the months before Margaret arrived. He had mentioned it to Clara the way he mentioned everything that concerned him, directly, without preamble, without dressing it in anything softer than it was. "Will I be enough?" he had said. For all of it. For the years of it. Clara had looked at him. "You came with lumber the morning after the flood," she said, without being asked. Without ever mentioning it afterward, she held his gaze. "That is what a father does. You already know how." He didn't bring it up again. In the September of 1887, 4 years after the pie and the joke that wasn't a joke, and the morning on the porch, Edmund was checking the boundary fence when he saw Clara coming across the field. She had Margaret on her hip, 2 years old now, red-haired and serious-faced, looking at the world with the focused attention of a small person who is filing everything away for future reference. Clara came to the fence. He opened the gate. She handed him the girl, who regarded him with gray eyes that were completely his, and looked at the mountains with an expression of satisfaction, as though the mountains had passed some assessment she'd been conducting. Edmund held his daughter and looked at his wife in the September morning light, and thought about a Tuesday 4 years ago when he had tried to make a joke and accidentally told the truth, and a woman had answered him in a way he hadn't understood for 2 weeks. "If only I had been 20 years younger," he said. Not as deflection this time. Not as the half-apology of a man trying to make something smaller than it was. He said it as acknowledgement, as an honest reckoning with what he had almost let his own arithmetic tract from him. Clara looked at him with the expression that had started everything. 20 years younger would have been someone else, she said. "I needed this. I needed you. Exactly you. Exactly this morning." Margaret, sitting on her father's arm, looked between them with the serene self-possession of a 2-year-old who does not yet have the language for what she is witnessing, but is absorbing it anyway, storing it somewhere deep in the place where a person's understanding of love is first built. Edmund closed the gate behind him and walked across the field with his family in the September light, and he was grateful. Grateful past the reach of any arithmetic he'd ever done, that he had made the pie worth saying something foolish about. Here's what Edmund Hale almost did. He almost let the numbers make his decision for him. He counted his years and found them too many. He measured the space between 56 and 26 and concluded that the distance disqualified him. He was being sensible, he told himself. He was being realistic. He was being, as Clara would have said with that patient directness of hers, wrong about which numbers mattered, because Edmund was counting the wrong things. He was counting years when he should have been counting mornings. He was counting the distance between their ages when he should have been counting the consistency of a man who showed up with lumber without being asked and never once turned it into a debt. He was measuring himself against a standard that had nothing to do with who he actually was, and everything to do with what the town expected a man of his years to believe about himself. Clara was counting differently. She counted the fence lumber and the Tuesday conversations and the particular quality of a person who is the same in all conditions, the same in hard winters and easy summers, the same to the cattle broker in town as to the old dog on the porch. She counted the evidence, not the calendar, and the evidence told her everything she needed to know. This is the thing that age arithmetic almost always gets wrong. Years are a container. What matters is what you have done with them. Whether you have spent them becoming someone more patient, more present, more genuinely useful to the people around you, or whether you have spent them becoming smaller, harder, more defended against the world. Edmund had spent 56 years becoming exactly who he was, and who he was turned out to be precisely what someone had been watching for from across a field for most of her adult life. Don't let the arithmetic stop you. Don't let the number on the calendar convince you that what you have to offer isn't enough, isn't worth offering, isn't worth the risk of walking to the fence line and being honest about it. It might be exactly enough. It might be precisely what someone has been walking toward. Tuesday after Tuesday, pie in hand, waiting for you to understand what they've been saying all along. I want to say something before we close today. If you made it all the way to this part of the story, thank you. That is not a small thing. You gave this story your full attention, and I know that attention is one of the rarest things any of us has to give. These stories exist because of you. Every comment you leave, every time you share an episode with someone you think might need an hour of something quiet and true, that is what makes it possible to keep going. You are the reason this exists. Wherever you are today, whether the sun is just coming up or you're sitting in the dark with your headphones in, I hope Clara and Edmund gave you something warm to think about, something worth carrying. God bless every single one of you listening today, every one of you. Until next time, keep walking across the field.